What happens when Hollywood's biggest star sits across from morning television's most relentless interrogator? The answer: chaos, tension, and one of the most explosive interviews ever aired live. Before we get there, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because this story is pure wildfire. The Good Morning America studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. Camera operators checked angles, makeup artists hovered with powder brushes, and producers darted between monitors clutching clipboards. But beneath the routine hum, something was different, a current of electricity in the air. At the anchor desk, George Stephanopoulos flipped through his notes with a focus that bordered on predatory. His crew recognized the look, the hunting face. He had smelled blood in the water. Brad Pitt arrived right on time, or of course he did. The man was Hollywood punctuality incarnate. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, he breezed through the studio doors with that effortless charm that had made him a legend. His easy grin lit up the green room as he shook hands with production assistants. From the control booth, George watched him on the monitor, eyes narrowing. "Remember," he told his producer, Sarah, as she adjusted his mic, "we're going deep today. No fluff, no softball questions. The audience deserves substance." Sarah hesitated. She'd worked with George long enough to know what substance meant in his world, the kind that made publicists sweat. "The exec said to keep it professional, George. This is morning television, not a deposition." George's laugh was short and cold. "Professional doesn't mean boring. Brad Pitt thinks he can waltz in here and charm his way through another puff piece? Not today." Meanwhile, in the green room, Brad's energy couldn't have been more different. Relaxed, affable, the consummate movie star. He reviewed talking points with his publicist, Jennifer, while sipping coffee. "George can be intense," Jennifer warned, giving him one last swipe of powder. "But it's GMA, Brad. How bad could it get?" Brad chuckled, that effortless charisma glinting like armor. "Please, I've handled worse. Remember that British guy who tried to ambush me about my divorce? Compared to that, this'll be a breeze." A stage manager poked his head in. "Mr. Pitt, we're ready for you." As Brad walked to the set, the studio audience erupted in applause. He waved, flashed the grin, took his seat opposite George. "Back in 30 seconds, the stage manager called. George leaned in just enough for only Brad to hear. "Hope you're ready for a real conversation today. Not just another PR run?" Brad didn't flinch. The smile stayed, though there was a flicker of something harder in his eyes. "Always ready for the real stuff, George. Makes for better television, right?" The red light blinked on. "Welcome back to Good Morning America," George said, voice smooth as glass. "We're joined by Academy Award winner Brad Pitt. His new film is smashing box office records worldwide." Brad nodded graciously. "Thanks for having me, George. Always a pleasure. Let's start with the obvious," George began. "Your new film deals with themes of redemption and second chances. Given your very public personal struggles in recent years, how much of yourself did you put into this character?" The shift in tone was instant, like the room exhaled wrong. The question hit like a slap. This was supposed to be about the movie, the work, not the tabloid fodder. Brad's media instincts kicked in. His voice stayed even. "I think any actor draws from their life experiences to bring authenticity to a role. But at the end of the day, it's fiction. It's about universal emotions and not my personal life," George pressed. "But the parallels are clear, aren't they? A man trying to rebuild his reputation, reconnect with his family, prove he's changed. That's not just acting, Mel. That's autobiography." The hum of cameras was suddenly deafening. Even the crew sensed it. The shift from friendly interview to confrontation. Brad's jaw tightened, barely perceptible. "I think you might be reading more into it than necessary, George. It's a story. I'm just the guy bringing it to life." George leaned in, voice sharpening like a prosecutor's. "Come on, Brad. Your audience isn't stupid. They see the connection. The real question is, do you have the courage to acknowledge it?" Courage. The word hung in the air. A challenge. A dare. And the first crack in the veneer of civility. And just like that, what began as a standard morning show puff piece was teetering on the edge of becoming live television legend. Brad's voice carried a new edge. Cold, deliberate, razor sharp. "I've got plenty of courage, George. What I don't have is an obligation to turn every interview into a therapy session for your entertainment." The air in the studio turned electric. Camera operators exchanged uneasy glances. In the control room, the director waved frantically for George to dial it back, but the host didn't even look up. He was in his element now, fueled by conflict, chasing the scent of controversy like a shark in open water. "Nobody's asking for therapy," George said smoothly. "But when you're promoting a film about accountability and growth, isn't it fair to ask if you've actually learned anything from your own mistakes?" Brad's jaw tightened. For the first time, the famous composure was beginning to strain. "What mistakes are you referring to exactly?" George's smile flickered, not pleasant, not kind. "Well, let's start with your marriage. The custody battle, the allegations. Do you think you handled all of that with the maturity you're portraying on screen?" The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Brad's publicist, standing in the wings, was motioning desperately to cut the segment. George didn't see or didn't care. His focus was locked on his target. Brad's eyes flashed. The movie star charm that had carried him through decades of interviews was gone, stripped away to something harder, rawer. "I think we need to redirect this conversation back to why I'm here, George of the film." But George had tasted blood, and there was no turning back. "The film is about a man confronting his past mistakes," he pressed. "So I'll ask again. Do you think you handled your divorce and custody situation with the same maturity you're claiming to have found?" "My personal life is not up for discussion on morning television." Brad's tone was steady, but the storm was visible now, behind the eyes, in the clenched fists on the armrest. "If you want to talk about acting, the story, the craft, fine. But we're not doing this." George leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. "But Brad, your career is built on your public image. You can't have it both ways. You can't sell tickets off your celebrity and then demand privacy when things get uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Brad laughed, short, humorless. "George, I've been doing interviews longer than some of your staff have been alive. This isn't about comfort. It's about basic professional respect, something you seem to have forgotten." The control room was chaos now, voices shouting through headsets, producers scrambling. But George had already pulled out his earpiece. He was running on instinct and ego. "Professional respect," George repeated, voice rising. "Is that what you call refusing to answer legitimate questions about your behavior? About the impact your actions had on your children?" That was the line. The one Brad had been praying George wouldn't cross. Brad's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. When he spoke, his voice was low and lethal. "You just crossed a line you can't uncross, George. My kids are off limits, period." George didn't blink. "Your kids weren't off limits when you made choices that affected them, were they? The custody evaluations, the therapy sessions, the court documents, it's all public record. Are you saying the public doesn't have a right to understand the man behind the movie star?" Brad stood up, slowly, deliberately. His microphone pack hit the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent studio. Gasps rippled through the audience. This wasn't a segment anymore. It was a live detonation. "Sit down, Brad," George ordered, voice taut with authority. "We're in the middle of an interview." "No," Brad said, his voice ringing across the studio. "What we're in the middle of is an ambush. You invited me here to talk about my work, and instead you're playing amateur psychologist on live television." George stayed seated, posture rigid, eyes cold. "I brought you here for an honest conversation, something your publicists clearly haven't prepared you for." "Honest?" Brad's laugh was sharp as glass. "There's nothing honest about this. This is sensationalism wearing the mask of journalism. You're not asking questions, you're trying to score points." The audience was dead silent, every face glued to the unfolding train wreck. Camera operators hesitated. No one dared cut away. George's tone turned icy. "I've already made my name, Brad. I've interviewed presidents, prime ministers, world leaders. I don't need to tear down a celebrity to make headlines. But I also don't coddle people who think fame makes them untouchable." Brad's control finally cracked. His voice rose, his presence filling the room. "Untouchable? You think that's what this is about? This is about decency, about knowing where the line is and not crossing it just to make yourself look brave." George rose from his chair, matching Brad's height, their faces now inches apart. "Your children are part of the story because you made them part of it," he shot back. "Every decision, every headline, every court filing, that was you." The silence that followed was suffocating, and for the first time all morning, the man who'd mastered every spotlight in Hollywood looked ready to walk away from it entirely. Don't blame me for asking the questions everyone else is thinking, George said, his tone measured but cold. Everyone else? Brad's anger was building to a crescendo. You mean your producers? Your network executives counting ratings while you exploit my family for entertainment. Those are the people whose thoughts you're worried about? The confrontation had evolved beyond an interview. It was now a philosophical clash about fame, privacy, and the media's hunger to dissect the people it claims to celebrate. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every flicker of tension, every breath between them. I'm worried about delivering honest journalism to our viewers, George replied, voice steady, almost sanctimonious. They deserve more than rehearsed talking points. They deserve to know who you really are beneath the Hollywood polish. Who I really am, Brad repeated, his composure finally breaking. Who I really am is a father trying to protect his children from exactly this kind of circus. Who I really am is someone who came here in good faith to discuss his work and walked into a character assassination disguised as an interview. George leaned forward slightly, sensing the opportunity. Character assassination or character examination? There's a difference, Brad, and the fact that you can't tell which one this is says everything about where you are mentally right now. That was it, the final psychological thrust. George had gone from attacking Brad's career to questioning his sanity, and he'd done it live on air. Brad's publicist had stopped signaling. She was now on the phone, her voice urgent, likely speaking to lawyers or executives. The stage manager stood frozen, headset crackling with whispered orders. Let it play out. You want to examine my character? Brad's voice had dropped again, soft but lethal. Let's examine yours, George. What kind of man ambushes a guest? What kind of man uses someone's children as ammunition? What kind of man hides behind the banner of journalism while practicing sophisticated bullying? For the first time, George's expression faltered. He'd expected Brad to storm off or break down, not to fight back with precision and fire. I'm asking the questions that need to be asked, George said. But there was less conviction now, a hairline crack in the armor. No, Brad shot back. You're asking the questions that generate the most controversy, the most headlines, and the most clicks. There's a difference between journalism and exploitation, and you've crossed that line so far. You can't even see it anymore. The studio was a pressure cooker, the silence so taut it seemed ready to snap, and then George did it. He crossed the final line. You talk about exploitation, Brad, but isn't that exactly what you did to your own family? You used them for your image, your career, your ego. The blow landed like a gunshot. Brad's face went pale, then flushed crimson. The years of media training, of charm and diplomacy vanished. How dare you, he said, barely more than a whisper, but every syllable crackled with danger. How dare you sit there and lecture me about my family? George pressed on, sensing victory but blind to the edge he was walking. I'm not lecturing. I'm asking you to take accountability. Your ex-wife, your children, they've paid the price for your choices. When do you start owning that instead of hiding behind your publicist and legal team? That was the breaking point. Brad took a step toward the desk, the air around him crackling with fury. You want accountability? Fine. Here's some accountability. You're a failed political correspondent who couldn't make it in real journalism, so you landed here, ambushing actors to feel relevant again. The words hit their mark. George's composure cracked, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Excuse me? You heard me, Brad said, fully in control now, his anger turned razor sharp. You sit here every morning pretending to be some kind of hard-hitting journalist, but what you really are is a glorified talk show host, desperate to feel important. George stood, face flushed, eyes blazing. I've interviewed presidents. I've covered wars, elections, constitutional crises. Don't you dare question my credentials, then act like it, Brad fired back. Stop behaving like a tabloid reporter who lucked into a network contract. You want to be a serious journalist? Then ask serious questions about serious topics. Don't hide behind the word journalism while you feed the gossip machine. The audience didn't make a sound. You could feel the collective heartbeat of the room, fast, shallow, stunned. Camera operators kept filming, but several averted their eyes, uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Two men live on national television, locked in a battle that had nothing to do with film, and everything to do with pride, ego, and the breaking point of human dignity. This had gone far beyond entertainment. It was darker now, personal, venomous. You think because you've memorized a few lines and look good on camera that you understand how the real world works? George's voice was rising, his own restraint unraveling. You live in a bubble of yes-men and sycophants. You wouldn't know real accountability if it hit you in the face. Brad laughed, sharp, bitter. Accountability? You want to talk about that? Let's talk about yours. How many careers have you torpedoed with your ambush interviews? How many people have you humiliated just to prove you're still relevant? When's the last time you looked in the mirror and asked if you've become everything you once claimed to stand against? The gloves were off. The polished morning show facade had completely dissolved, leaving only raw human fury. At least I'm not hiding behind a movie star image while my family falls apart, George shot back. At least I'm not running from my responsibilities. Brad took a step closer to the desk, close enough that security began to shift nervously on the sidelines. You know what your problem is, George? You've spent so long pretending to be the smartest man in the room, you've forgotten how to be a decent one. You mistake cruelty for intellect, aggression for insight, and your own bitterness for wisdom, George sneered. Please. You think because people pay to watch you pretend to be other people, your opinions matter. They don't. You're an entertainer, nothing more. Each insult hit harder than the last. Brad dismantling George's journalistic integrity. George reducing Brad to a shallow celebrity. Brad's voice went low, cold. This interview is over. You don't get to decide that, George snapped. You agreed to be here. You signed the contracts. You don't walk out just because you can't handle the truth. Watch me. Brad turned to leave, but George's next words froze him mid-step. That's right. Walk away. Just like you walked away from your marriage and your kids. The air left the studio. Brad spun back, face carved in fury. You just made the biggest mistake of your career, George. Security moved in. 2 men in suits approaching from opposite sides. The tension was a live wire ready to snap. George stood his ground, defiant. Is that a threat? Are you threatening me on live television? Brad's voice was quiet, too quiet. No, it's a promise. You just ended your own career with that last comment. You think you understand accountability? Wait until your network sees this footage. Until the advertisers start pulling out. Until the internet gets hold of it. The reality of what had just unfolded began to dawn across the studio. The crew stood frozen. No one breathed. No one moved. This wasn't a segment anymore. It was a career implosion caught live. You can't intimidate me with threats about my job, George said. But his voice was trembling now. I don't have to, Brad replied evenly. You did this to yourself. Every second of it is live. Every word recorded. You dragged my family into this for ratings, and the whole world just saw it. The stage manager finally stepped forward, pale and sweating. Gentlemen, we need to cut to commercial. No, George barked. We're finishing this interview. The interview is finished, Brad said. He turned toward the main camera, voice steady and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I came here to talk about a film I'm proud of. A story about redemption and growth. Instead, I was ambushed and attacked under the guise of journalism. This isn't what morning television should be. And it's sure as hell not journalism. He unclipped his mic, letting it drop to the floor with a sharp thud. George, I hope this was worth it, Brad said, his gaze cutting like steel. I hope destroying whatever credibility you had left was worth the 5 minutes of fame you just bought. He turned and walked off the set, past the stunned audience, past the frozen crew. Don't you dare walk away from me, George shouted after him. We're not finished. Brad stopped at the edge of the stage, turned. Yes, George, he said quietly. We are. Completely finished. The cameras kept rolling as security followed Brad off stage. George stood alone behind the desk, his face pale under the studio lights. Around him the set was silent, the air heavy with the weight of irreversible consequences. And that's how one of Hollywood's biggest stars walked off. Good morning, America. After the most explosive interview in live television history, the fallout would ripple for years, but that's a story for another day.